The billionaire forced his pregnant wife onto her knees to scrub the marble floor where his mistress had deliberately spilled champagne. 150 guests watched. Some laughed. Most filmed it for social media. His mother slapped her across the face when she did not clean fast enough. The red handprint formed instantly on her cheek. Her husband stood 15 feet away, champagne in hand, and did nothing. But here is what none of them knew. The woman on her knees, the one they called worthless, the one they humiliated for entertainment, had spent 3 years building a tech empire from her laptop at 3 in the morning while her husband slept off his bourbon and his mistress's perfume. In exactly 72 hours, she would be worth $340 million, more than everyone in that room combined. They thought she was broken. They thought she was nothing. They thought a pregnant woman with no family and no resources would simply accept whatever cruelty they decided she deserved. They were catastrophically wrong. What happens when a woman who has been documenting every insult, every slap, every moment of abuse for 4 years finally decides to stop waiting? What happens when the quiet one turns out to be the most dangerous person in the room? This story will show you the devastating cost of underestimating someone based on their appearance. It will teach you that patience can be the most powerful weapon when used correctly, and it will prove that the people who hurt you in silence will eventually face you in public. Value statement. Dear viewers, this powerful story contains real lessons you can apply to your own life. You will learn how to recognize manipulative relationships before they destroy you. You will discover why documenting everything matters when the system is designed to silence you. And you will understand that your worth is never decided by people who benefit from making you feel small. Meaning of the story. This is not just entertainment. This is a blueprint for survival. Every woman who has ever been told she was worthless, every person who has been trapped by someone with more money and more power, every survivor who wondered if fighting back was even possible. This story is for you. Real strength is not about destroying your enemies. It is about building something that helps the people who come after you. That is the message at the heart of everything you are about to hear. The marble was cold against Elena Mitchell's knees, but she barely felt it anymore. 7 months pregnant, her belly straining against a dress that cost $19 from a consignment shop downtown, she scrubbed champagne from floors that belonged to the mansion she was supposed to call home. 150 guests watched. Some pretended to look away. Most did not bother pretending. The woman standing above her wore Louboutin heels that cost more than Elena's entire wardrobe. Vanessa Price held her phone at the perfect angle, filming what she would later caption as content for the girls, her 2 million Instagram followers, eager for another glimpse into the glamorous life she had stolen, piece by piece, from the woman now cleaning at her feet. Elena's husband stood 15 feet away, champagne glass in hand, laughing at something his mother had said. Daniel Thornton, senior vice president at Sterling Financial Group, billionaire by inheritance and cruelty by choice, had not looked at his pregnant wife once in the past 30 minutes. But Elena was not thinking about the humiliation. She was not thinking about the camera phone documenting her degradation. She was not even thinking about the baby kicking against her ribs as she bent forward to wipe another streak of expensive champagne from imported Italian marble. She was thinking about the email she had received 6 hours ago, the one that read, "Acquisition offer accepted, $340 million. Final paperwork ready in 72 hours. In exactly 3 days, Elena Mitchell would be worth more than everyone in this room combined." But none of them knew that. None of them had ever bothered to ask what she did on her laptop at 3 in the morning while her husband slept off his bourbon and his mistress's perfume. They thought she was broken. They thought she was nothing. They had no idea that every insult, every slap, every moment of calculated cruelty had been documented, catalogued, and prepared for a reckoning that would leave them with nothing but regrets and the memory of a quiet woman they should never have underestimated. Margaret Thornton descended the curved staircase with the theatrical timing of someone who had rehearsed her entrance in front of a bathroom mirror. At 64 years old, she had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of cruelty disguised as breeding, her diamond necklace catching the chandelier light like a spotlight, announcing the arrival of someone who considered herself royalty. She surveyed Elena on the floor with the satisfaction of a woman whose life's work had been the systematic destruction of anyone she deemed unworthy of breathing the same air as the Thornton family name. "Daniel, darling," Margaret called out, her voice sweet as antifreeze. "I think your wife needs some supervision. She has been working on that same spot for 10 minutes now. Perhaps she is simply not accustomed to actual labor." The guests laughed on cue. The sound cut through Elena like broken glass, but she kept her face carefully blank. 4 years of marriage had taught her that showing pain only encouraged them. Vanessa circled closer, her heel deliberately stepping on Elena's fingers as she repositioned for a better camera angle. Elena did not flinch. She had learned that flinching was a luxury she could not afford. "You missed a spot right there," Vanessa said, pointing to an area Elena had already cleaned 3 times. Her voice carried across the banquet hall with a projection that came from private school debate training and summers in the Hamptons. "I mean, if you are going to do the only job you are actually qualified for, you might as well do it properly." Elena said nothing. Her hand gripped the cleaning rag tighter, knuckles going white, but her face remained a mask of careful emptiness. From the corner of her eye, she saw Rosa Martinez, the Thornton family housekeeper for 20 years, watching from near the kitchen entrance. Rosa's expression was carefully neutral, but Elena caught the slight nod, the silent message that said, "I see you, I am with you. When this is over, we will remember who stood where." Margaret approached with steps that clicked against marble like a countdown to detonation. She stopped directly in front of Elena, close enough that her designer heels were inches from Elena's swollen belly. "You know," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a volume that somehow carried further than her shouts ever did, "I told Daniel from the beginning that marrying you was a mistake. A waitress, a nobody from nowhere. I warned him that trash cannot be polished into treasure, no matter how much money you throw at it." She reached down and gripped Elena's chin, forcing her face upward. Elena met her mother-in-law's eyes without blinking. What Margaret saw there should have warned her: the calculation, the patience, the particular stillness of someone who was not enduring but waiting. But Margaret Thornton had spent 64 years seeing only what she expected to see, and she expected to see a broken woman with no resources, no family, and no way to fight back. Her hand connected with Elena's cheek, with a sound that echoed across the marble floor. The slap was hard enough to turn Elena's head, hard enough to leave a mark that would purple into a bruise by morning. The guests fell silent. Even the ones who had been pretending not to watch dropped their pretense. Vanessa's phone captured everything. Her smile widened as she imagined the engagement this would generate, the comments, the shares, the delicious cruelty of making a pregnant woman's pain into entertainment. Elena touched her cheek, where the handprint was already forming an angry red welts. She looked at her husband, who had not moved, had not spoken, had not done a single thing to stop any of this. Then she looked at Margaret, and she smiled. It was not the smile they were used to seeing on her face, not the trembling, apologetic expression of a woman who knew her place. The smile was older, colder, the kind of smile that appeared on faces right before empires collapsed and certainties dissolved into expensive regrets. "Thank you," Elena said softly. Margaret's confidence flickered just for a moment. "Thank you? What could you possibly be thanking me for?" Elena slowly rose to her feet. Bitambes rose to her feet, the movement taking longer than it should have because of her pregnancy. But when she reached her full height, something had changed in the atmosphere. "For the documentation," Elena said. Her voice was quiet, but carried across the banquet hall, because every conversation had stopped. 200 people, holding their collective breath without knowing why. "Your assault was captured on 17 different phones. Your witnesses include 3 attorneys, 2 judges, and a journalist from the Financial Times." She pulled out a phone that made 2 investment bankers near the champagne fountain actually gasp out loud. They recognized the model, a custom device that cost $70,000 and required personal authorization from the manufacturer's CEO to purchase. "But more importantly," Elena continued, "you just violated the domestic violence clause in my prenuptial agreement, the one your lawyers insisted I sign without reading, the one that states any physical assault by immediate family members voids all protective provisions and triggers automatic legal proceedings." The color drained from Margaret's face like water from a broken vase. Elena pressed a single button on her phone, and somewhere in the distance, they could all hear the sound of vehicles pulling up outside. Multiple vehicles, moving with an urgency that suggested someone extremely powerful was about to make an entrance. The coffee shop where Elena Mitchell first met Daniel Thornton was the kind of place that served overpriced lattes to people who believed expensive coffee was a personality trait. She had been working on her laptop in the corner, sketching designs for a client who wanted a logo that looked expensive but cost nothing, when a shadow fell across her screen. "Is this seat taken?" She looked up to find the most handsome man she had ever seen in person, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing a smile that seemed designed specifically to make women forget their common sense. "There are 12 empty tables," Elena pointed out. Daniel Thornton sat down anyway, sliding one of the cups toward her. "I know, but you looked like you could use better coffee than whatever that is." His eyes moved to the paper cup beside her laptop, the one from the gas station across the street that sold coffee for 99 cents. Elena should have recognized the warning sign, the assumption that he knew what she needed better than she did, the casual dismissal of her choices, the way he inserted himself into her space without asking permission. Instead, she saw charm. She saw attention. She saw a man who noticed her when she had spent 26 years feeling invisible. Their courtship was a whirlwind. 3 months of flowers and fancy dinners and the intoxicating feeling of being chosen by someone who could have had anyone. Daniel was attentive, generous, quick to laugh, and slow to anger. He asked about her graphic design work. He remembered her favorite foods. He made her feel like she was the only woman in every room. Looking back, Elena would understand that this was the trap, the calculated performance of a man who had learned that the best way to control someone was to make them believe they could not survive without you. The first red flag came at their engagement dinner. Margaret Thornton swept into the restaurant like a cold front moving through summer, her eyes cataloging Elena's dress, her shoes, her haircut, her everything with the precision of a surgeon identifying tumors. "Oh," Margaret said, her voice dripping with something that was not quite sweetness. "That is a very brave choice." Elena looked down at her dress. It was the nicest thing she owned, a navy blue sheath she had saved for 3 months to afford. "What do you mean?" Margaret's smile did not reach her eyes. "Nothing, dear. It is just so refreshing to see someone who does not care what anyone thinks about them. Elena waited for Daniel to say something, to defend her, to point out that his mother had just delivered an insult wrapped in tissue paper. Daniel said nothing. He had watched with that same charming smile, as if his mother's cruelty was simply part of the background noise he had learned not to hear. That night, Elena should have written down what happened. She should have documented the date, the time, the exact words Margaret used, the way Daniel's silence was its own form of complicity. She should have started a file. But she was in love, and love, she would learn, was the most effective blindfold ever invented. The wedding was small by Thornton standards, 300 guests. Elena's side of the church held her best friend, Joyce Palmer, 2 colleagues from her design firm, and a cousin who came mostly for the free food. Daniel's side overflowed with generations of old money and older grudges. Margaret had insisted on a prenuptial agreement, 37 pages of legalese, that Elena's lawyer had called standard for families of this wealth level. Elena had signed without reading past the first few pages. What she did not know, then, was that the document contained clauses Margaret had specifically inserted, clauses about inheritance, about abuse documentation requirements, about what would happen if certain conditions were met. Margaret Thornton, for all her cruelty, was also stupid in the particular way that only confident people can be. She had built a legal trap designed to keep Elena powerless, never considering that the same document might one day be used as a weapon against the Thornton family instead. The marriage deteriorated slowly, then all at once. Year 1. Daniel worked late most nights. Elena told herself this was normal. Ambitious men had demanding jobs. Year 2. Margaret's visits became weekly. Her comments became sharper. Daniel never defended Elena and eventually stopped pretending he did not hear. Year 3. Elena found the first hotel receipt, then the credit card statement for jewelry she had never received, then the text message from someone named V that said, "Last night was incredible." She confronted Daniel. He called her paranoid, insecure, crazy. He said she was imagining things. He said if she kept accusing him of cheating, maybe he would actually do it just to make her accusations worth something. Elena stopped confronting him, but she started documenting. She also started building. It began as a way to process her own situation, a simple app that helped users track incidents of emotional abuse, date, time, what was said, who witnessed it. A digital diary with security features that prevented deletion or tampering. She worked on it at 3 in the morning when Daniel was asleep or away. She worked on it in coffee shops and libraries and the bathroom of her own home because it was the only room with a lock. She worked on it with the obsessive focus of someone who had finally found a way to turn their pain into something useful. The app grew. She added features for connecting users with pro bono lawyers, templates for restraining orders, resources for emergency housing, a community forum where women could share their stories and realize they were not alone. She called it dignity because that was what abusers took first and what survivors needed to reclaim. By year 4, Dignity had 200,000 users. Elena had incorporated under a shell company with Joyce Palmer's help. She had received interest from venture capital firms who saw the market potential of an app that served a population no one else was helping. And she had received an acquisition offer that would make her worth $340 million. All while her husband believed she was worthless. All while his mother slapped her at dinner parties. All while his mistress filmed her humiliation for Instagram content. Elena had learned something important in those 4 years of documented cruelty. Patience was the most devastating weapon when used correctly. and she had been patient for 1,461 days. Now, standing in the banquet hall with her cheek still stinging from Margaret's palm, Elena was finally ready to stop waiting. The vehicles outside were getting closer. The guests were beginning to murmur. Daniel had finally looked at his wife, and what he saw in her eyes made him take an involuntary step backward. "Elena," he said, his voice uncertain for the first time since she had known him, "what is happening? Who did you call?" Elena smiled at him, with something that looked almost like pity. "No one who can save you," she said, "but someone who can document everything that happens next." The vehicles that pulled up outside the Grand Sterling Banquet Hall were not police cars. They were not limousines filled with wealthy rescuers. They were news vans. Specifically, they were news vans from 3 different networks, each one containing journalists who had received an anonymous tip about an event worth covering at the Thornton anniversary celebration. Elena had not called her father, because her father had died when she was 7 years old. She had not called a secret army of lawyers, because she could not afford lawyers who charged by the hour. What she had done was spend 3 years learning exactly how the world of the wealthy actually worked. And she had learned that nothing frightened rich people more than public exposure of the cruelty they believed their money entitled them to commit. The first reporter through the door was a woman named Patricia Wells from Channel 7. She was known for her coverage of domestic abuse cases, particularly among the wealthy, and she had been following Elena's anonymous tips for the past 6 months. The footage she captured in the next 15 minutes would eventually be viewed 47 million times. Margaret Thornton's face transformed from confusion to horror as she realized cameras were now documenting the aftermath of her assault. The red handprint on Elena's cheek. The cleaning supplies scattered on the marble floor. The 150 guests who had watched and laughed and filmed, but were now desperately trying to delete their own recordings. "This is private property," Margaret shouted, her voice losing its cultured edge. "You cannot be here. Daniel, call security. Call the police. Get these people out of my home." "Your home?" Elena asked softly. "The deed is in Daniel's name, which means under community property law, it is also my home, and as a resident, I have the right to invite guests, including members of the press." Daniel grabbed Elena's arm, his grip tight enough to leave marks. "What the hell do you think you are doing? Do you have any idea who my family is? We will destroy you. We will take everything." Elena looked down at his hand on her arm, then up at the cameras that were recording everything. "You might want to reconsider that grip," she said. "Given that your mother just assaulted me on camera, and you are now adding your own documented incident of physical intimidation." Daniel released her arm like it had burned him. "This is insane," he said. "You are insane. I am calling our lawyers right now. I want her removed from this property." "On what grounds?" Elena asked. "I have committed no crime. I have made no threats. I simply invited journalists to document a social event at a home I legally occupy." She turned to face the cameras, her posture straight despite the exhaustion of carrying a 7-month pregnancy through hours of designed humiliation. "My name is Elena Mitchell Thornton. For the past 4 years, I have been the target of systematic emotional and physical abuse by my husband and his family. Tonight, in front of over 100 witnesses, my mother-in-law, Margaret Thornton, struck me in the face. While I was 7 months pregnant, my husband Daniel Thornton watched and did nothing. His mistress, Vanessa Price, filmed the assault for social media content. Vanessa's face went pale. She was already frantically trying to delete the footage from her phone. But 3 different news cameras had already captured the Instagram live stream she had started during Elena's humiliation. "I want to be very clear," Elena continued, speaking directly to the cameras. I am not here to destroy anyone. I am here because silence protects abusers, and speaking out is the first step towards safety for everyone who has experienced what I have experienced." She touched the bruise forming on her cheek. "This mark will heal in a few days. The documentation will last forever." Margaret finally found her voice. "This is lies. All of it. She is a manipulative gold digger who trapped my son into marriage, and now she is trying to extort our family. I barely touched her. If anything, she probably hit herself to create this whole scene." "The problem with that theory," Elena said, "is that 17 different phones captured the moment of impact from 17 different angles, including the phone of Judge Harrison Bradley, who I believe presides over family court in this county." A man in the crowd suddenly looked very uncomfortable, and the phone of attorney Rachel Foster from Collins and Associates, who specializes in high-profile divorce cases. A woman near the champagne fountain set down her glass with a trembling hand. And the phone of Jonathan Webb, financial reporter for the Wall Street Journal, who was invited tonight by Daniel himself to document what was supposed to be a celebration of Thornton family success. A man Elena had never spoken to before slowly raised his hand in acknowledgement, his expression caught between professional interest and personal horror at what he had witnessed, and not interrupted. The banquet hall had become very quiet. Daniel looked at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. In 4 years of marriage, he had never once asked what she did during the hours he spent with Vanessa. He had never wondered why she stayed up late on her laptop. He had never bothered to learn anything about the woman he had promised to love and protect. "Who are you?" he whispered. Elena's smile was sad. "I am exactly who I have always been," she said. "You just never cared enough to notice." Rosa Martinez appeared at Elena's elbow, carrying a coat and a bag that Elena recognized as her emergency kit, the one she had packed 3 years ago and hidden in Rosa's quarters, waiting for exactly this moment. "The car is ready," Rosa said quietly. "Joyce is waiting outside." Elena nodded and began walking toward the exit, moving through the crowd of stunned guests who parted before her like water before a ship. Margaret called after her, "You think this changes anything? We will bury you in legal fees. We will prove you are an unfit mother. We will take that baby, and you will never see it again." Elena stopped at the door and turned back to face her mother-in-law. "I look forward to that conversation," she said. "In court, with documentation and cameras." She walked out into the night, where Joyce Palmer was waiting with a car and a folder full of legal documents and the particular expression of a best friend who had been waiting 4 years to watch her friend finally fight back. "You okay?" Joyce asked. Elena touched her cheek, where the bruise was deepening into purple. "I have been better," she said, "but I have also been worse, and this is just the beginning." The 3 weeks following the banquet hall incident were the closest Elena had ever come to believing she might actually win. The news coverage was extensive. 3 networks ran segments about the viral video of a billionaire's mother assaulting her pregnant daughter-in-law. Social media exploded with commentary about wealthy families and accountability. A hashtag called Justice4. Elena trended for 6 days. Vanessa Price's Instagram following dropped by 400,000 in a single week. Brands that had partnered with her issued statements distancing themselves from her actions. Her carefully curated image as a glamorous lifestyle influencer crumbled under the weight of footage showing her filming a pregnant woman's abuse for content. Margaret Thornton became a symbol of old money cruelty. Her country club quietly suggested she take a leave of absence from the social committee. Friends she had known for decades suddenly became unavailable for lunch. Daniel moved out of the family estate and into a hotel, where his lawyers advised him to stay while they figured out how to manage the public relations disaster his family had created. And Elena, for the first time in 4 years, slept through the night without fear. Joyce Palmer worked 18-hour days preparing the divorce filing. She documented every incident Elena had recorded over 46 months of marriage. She compiled financial records showing Daniel's hidden accounts and suspicious transfers. She built a case that any family court judge would recognize as textbook abuse. "This is solid," Joyce said during one of their strategy sessions, her voice filled with the particular energy of a lawyer who smelled victory. "We have documentation. We have witnesses. We have video evidence of assault. We have financial records showing he hid assets and maintained an affair for over a year. You are going to get everything, Elena. Full custody, the house, spousal support, everything." Elena wanted to believe her. She desperately wanted to believe that the system designed to protect families would actually work when it mattered. But something felt wrong. The Thorntons were too quiet. Margaret had not issued a single public statement. Daniel's lawyers had not responded to any of Joyce's communications. The silence felt less like surrender and more like preparation. She found out why on a Tuesday morning in March. The process server found her at the motel where she had been staying since leaving the estate. He was apologetic as he handed her the thick envelope of documents, his eyes moving to her pregnant belly with something like pity. Elena opened the envelope and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She was being served with divorce papers, but not the kind Joyce had been preparing. These papers accused Elena of emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and fraudulent misrepresentation of her background and intentions in the marriage. They claimed she had deliberately concealed mental health issues that made her an unfit mother. They included sworn affidavits from 3 psychiatrists Elena had never met, each one attesting to diagnoses that did not exist. And they were accompanied by a restraining order signed by a judge whose name Elena recognized from the banquet hall guest list, forbidding her from coming within 500 feet of the Thornton estate or any of its residents, which meant she could not access her clothes, her computer, her documentation files, or any of the evidence she had spent 4 years collecting. "Joyce," Elena said into the phone, her voice very calm in the way that only complete shock could produce. "We have a problem." The meeting with Joyce that afternoon was the most frightening conversation of Elena's life. "This is bad," Joyce said, spreading the documents across her small office desk. "They have been planning this for months, maybe longer. These psychiatric evaluations are dated over the past 2 years. They have been building a paper trail to make you look unstable. But I never saw any psychiatrists," Elena said. "These evaluations are fabricated. I know that. You know that. But the doctors who signed them are real, licensed professionals with spotless reputations. Either they have been paid off or someone gave them false information about fictional sessions." Joyce ran her hand through her hair, a gesture Elena had learned meant her friend was truly worried. "The restraining order is the bigger problem. All your documentation is in that house. Your laptop, your external drives, the cloud storage accounts you accessed from that network. Without that evidence, we have your word against theirs." "I have the video from the banquet," Elena said. 17 different phones captured Margaret hitting me." Joyce shook her head. "Inadmissible." "What? Why?" "Because this state requires 2-party consent for recording. Every single person who filmed that night did so without Margaret's explicit permission. Her lawyers have already filed motions to have all footage excluded from any legal proceedings." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "But the news stations already broadcast it," she said. "Millions of people saw what happened. Which is why public opinion is on your side, Joyce agreed. But public opinion does not decide custody cases. Judges do. And the judge assigned to your case is a man named William Crawford, who plays golf every Saturday with Margaret Thornton's brother. Elena stared at her friend. So what you are telling me, she said slowly, is that they have already won. Joyce's face was grim. What I am telling you is that the system is designed to protect people with money and connections. And the Thorntons have both. They have had months to prepare while we were reacting to whatever crisis they created. They control the narrative in the courtroom even if they have lost it in public. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. Elena, I need you to understand something. This is going to get worse before it gets better. They are going to try to take everything from you, including your baby, and they have the resources to keep fighting until you have nothing left. Elena placed her hands on her belly, feeling her daughter kick against her palms. She thought about the acquisition offer sitting in her email. $340 million that would finalize in less than 48 hours. Money that could hire every lawyer in the state. Money that could fight the Thornton machine indefinitely. But she also thought about Marcus Webb, Daniel's mentor at Sterling Financial, whose signature appeared on several of the documents in front of her. Marcus Webb, whose daughter Vanessa was Daniel's mistress. Marcus Webb, whose legal team had suddenly started asking questions about the shell company Elena had used to incorporate Dignity. The money might be coming, but so was something else, something that felt like a trap she could not yet see. I need you to do something for me, Elena said to Joyce. I need you to find out everything you can about Marcus Webb, his business dealings, his personal history, his connection to Vanessa Price. Joyce looked confused. Why? He is just Daniel's boss. Elena shook her head. No, she said. He is something else. I do not know what yet. But something about this feels coordinated in a way that goes beyond Margaret's cruelty. This is not just a family trying to protect their reputation. This is something bigger. She did not know how right she was, but she was about to find out. The week that destroyed Elena Mitchell began on a Monday and ended with her giving birth alone in a county hospital, wondering if she would ever see her daughter after the delivery. Day one started with a phone call from her lawyer. Elena, Joyce said, her voice strained in a way Elena had never heard before. I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm. What happened? The State Bar Association received a complaint against me this morning. They are claiming I engaged in professional misconduct during our preparation of your case. Fabricating evidence, witness tampering, fraudulent documentation. That is insane, Elena said. None of that is true. I know, but the complaint came with supporting materials, emails that look like they came from my account, documents that have my digital signature, bank records showing payments I never received for services I never provided. Joyce's voice cracked. Elena, I am going to have to step back from your case. If I do not, they will disbar me. I will lose everything I have built, and I will not be able to help anyone, including you. Elena sat down on the edge of the motel bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. They got to you, she said quietly. They got to everyone, Joyce replied. I heard from 3 other lawyers this morning who are considering taking your case. All of them received warnings about professional consequences if they get involved. So I have no legal representation, not officially, but I am not abandoning you. I will help from behind the scenes, research, strategy, connections. I just cannot appear in court on your behalf. Elena closed her eyes. This is how they win, she said. They do not beat you in court. They make sure you never get to court at all. Day 2 brought the locks. Elena drove to the Thornton estate to retrieve her medications, her pregnancy vitamins, the few personal items she had not been able to grab during her exit. She believed the restraining order only applied to contact with family members, not to accessing her own belongings from a home where she was legally a resident. She was wrong. Private security met her at the gate. Men in suits who informed her that her name had been removed from the residence registry, that her belongings had been boxed and would be delivered to an address of her choosing, that any attempt to enter the property would result in her arrest. She saw her clothes through the gate, garbage bags piled on the lawn, visible from the road, positioned so that neighbors and passers-by could see the billionaire's wife being treated like trash. Someone was filming from a car across the street. She would later discover the footage had been sold to a tabloid site that ran the story with the headline, "Gold Digger Gets Dug Out." Day 3 took Joyce. The ethics hearing was expedited with suspicious speed. Joyce was suspended from practicing law pending a full investigation. She called Elena from her car outside the Bar Association building, crying for the first time since Elena had known her. "I am so sorry," Joyce said through her tears. "I should have been more careful. I should have seen this coming. This is not your fault," Elena told her. "They would have found another way. I feel like I failed you." Elena thought about all the nights Joyce had stayed late researching, all the weekends she had sacrificed, all the hope she had poured into a case that the system had been designed to crush from the beginning. "You showed up," Elena said. "That is more than most people ever do." Day 4 broke Elena's body. The stress had been building for weeks. The sleepless nights, the constant fear, the weight of fighting alone against an enemy with unlimited resources. Her blood pressure had been climbing, and she had been ignoring the warning signs because she could not afford to stop fighting. She woke at 3 in the morning to pain and wetness and the immediate knowledge that something was very wrong. Her daughter was coming, 8 weeks early, and Elena was alone in a motel room with a phone that showed a declined payment for the ambulance service her insurance was supposed to cover. Daniel had canceled her insurance, retroactively. The same day the divorce papers were filed, Elena drove herself to the county hospital because it was the only option she had. She gripped the steering wheel through contractions that felt like her body was trying to tear itself apart. She talked to her daughter through the pain, promising her that everything would be okay, that mommy would figure this out, that they would survive this together. The delivery took 14 hours. Elena was alone for all of them. No husband beside her, holding her hand. No mother to tell her she was strong. No friend to advocate for her when the medical staff made decisions without explaining them. Just a woman in a hospital gown, fighting to bring her daughter into a world that seemed determined to crush them both. Grace Elena Mitchell was born at 4:17 in the afternoon, weighing just over 4 pounds. She was small but healthy. Her lungs developed enough to breathe on her own, her cries strong enough to fill the delivery room with sound. Elena held her daughter for 23 seconds before the NICU team took her away for monitoring. She would not hold her again for 5 days. Day 5 brought the bill. $47,000. That was what it cost to deliver a baby in America without insurance. NICU fees were additional. They were still being calculated. Elena stared at the number on the paperwork that a hospital administrator had brought to her bedside before she had even been moved to a recovery room. "We will need to discuss payment arrangements," the administrator said, her voice professionally sympathetic in the way that people who delivered bad news for a living learned to perfect. "Do you have anyone who can help you with this?" Elena thought about the acquisition money. 48 more hours, and she would have $340 million. But she also thought about Marcus Webb, whose lawyers had been circling her company like sharks, about the intellectual property claims that had appeared in her email that morning, about the way every path to survival seemed to close just as she reached for it. "I will figure it out," she said. The administrator's face suggested she heard that a lot from people who never did. Day 6 brought the custody filing. Elena was still in the hospital when the process server found her, still connected to monitors that tracked her vital signs, still waiting for permission to hold her daughter for more than a few minutes at a time. The documents informed her that Margaret Thornton had filed for emergency guardianship of the baby. The grounds cited were Elena's mental instability, her financial inability to provide care, and her pattern of self-harm that made her a danger to herself and her child. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Elena read the documents 3 times before she understood what they meant. They were not just trying to take her money, or her home, or her dignity. They were trying to take her daughter. And she had exactly 7 days to stop them. The man who appeared at Elena's hospital door on day 7 was the last person she expected to see. Thomas Thornton looked nothing like his brother. Where Daniel was polished and predatory, Thomas was rumpled and kind, with glasses that kept sliding down his nose and a messenger bag covered in tech conference stickers. He was also supposed to be in Seattle, 2,000 miles away, estranged from his family for the past 8 years. "Before you call security," Thomas said, holding up his hands, "I am not here for them. I am here for you." Elena's hand hovered over the nurse call button. "Why should I believe that?" "Because I have been your silent partner for 3 years," Thomas said. "I am the reason Dignity has the encryption protocols that even federal agencies cannot break. I wrote the code that protects your users' data, and I have been waiting for this moment since I watched my family destroy my father's memory and realized they would do the same to anyone who showed kindness in their presence." Elena stared at him. "You are the anonymous investor," she said slowly. "The one who contributed $200,000 in the first funding round, and the anonymous technical advisor who kept your servers running during the hack attempts, and the anonymous source who tipped off Patricia Wells about the banquet, and the anonymous pain in my brother's ass, who has been building a case against my own family for almost a decade." Thomas sat down in the visitor chair without being invited, his posture carrying the weight of someone who had been running from his own name for most of his adult life. "I need to tell you some things," he said, "about my father, about Margaret, about why I left, and why I am back now, and you need to decide if you trust me enough to let me help you." Elena looked at this stranger, who was also her business partner, who was also her enemy's brother, who was also apparently the only person in the Thornton family who had seen what she was building and chosen to support it rather than destroy it. "Talk," she said, "and I will decide." Bill. Thomas talked for 2 hours. He told her about growing up in the Thornton household, about watching his mother systematically dismantle everyone who threatened her control, about his father, Robert Thornton, who had been kind and quiet and ultimately destroyed by the woman he married. He told her that Robert had not died of heart failure, as the official records claimed. That 3 days before his death, Robert had told Thomas he was filing for divorce and exposing Margaret's insurance fraud. That 2 days before his death, Robert had given a sealed envelope to Rosa Martinez with instructions to keep it safe until it was needed. He told her that the coroner who signed the death certificate was Margaret's cousin, that no autopsy was performed, that the life insurance policy had paid out $4 million, which Margaret had used to consolidate her control over the family finances. He told her about Vanessa Price. "This is where it gets complicated," Thomas said. "Vanessa is not just some influencer who happened to catch Daniel's eye. She is Marcus Webb's daughter." Elena felt something click into place in her mind. "The intellectual property claim," she said. "Marcus Webb is not just blocking my acquisition. He planted Vanessa to get access to Daniel, which means access to Sterling Financial, which means access to everything. Thomas nodded. Daniel thinks Vanessa loves him. He thinks Marcus is his mentor and friend. He has no idea that he has been a pawn in a corporate takeover strategy for the past 18 months. Elena processed this information. So Daniel is also a victim, she said slowly. Daniel is a coward who watched his mother abuse you for 4 years and did nothing, Thomas replied, his voice hard. But yes, he is also being manipulated by people who are smarter and more ruthless than he is, which does not excuse anything he did. It just explains part of why he did it. Why are you telling me this now? Because they are going to take your daughter in 6 days if we do not stop them. And the only way to stop them is to expose everything. Not just what Margaret did to you. Everything she has done to my father, to Daniel, to everyone who ever stood in her way. Thomas leaned forward. I have been collecting evidence for 8 years. I have financial records. I have communications. I have documentation of fraud and manipulation and things that would make Margaret's assault on you look like a minor disagreement. But I need one thing I do not have. Rosa's envelope, the one my father gave her before he died. She has kept it hidden for 15 years because she was afraid of what Margaret would do if she found out. Elena thought about Rosa, who had stood in the kitchen doorway watching Margaret's cruelty for years, who had quietly brought Elena supplies and support, who had nodded in silent solidarity even when speaking would have cost her everything. Why would Rosa give it to me? Because you built something that helps women like her, Thomas said. Women who have been silenced. Women who have been afraid. Women who have been told they have no power. He gestured to his phone. Do you know how many messages Dignity receives every day from women who say your app saved their lives? Women who documented their abuse and got out safely? Women who found lawyers and resources and community because you created something that the system refused to provide? Rosa has been following your story since the beginning. She knows who you are. She knows what you have built, and she has been waiting 15 years for someone brave enough to use what she has kept hidden. Elena looked at her daughter through the NICU window. Grace was sleeping, tiny and perfect and completely unaware of the war being fought for her future. What do I have to do? Thomas smiled for the first time since he had walked through the door. First, we need to get your money unfrozen, which means we need to prove that Marcus Webb's intellectual property claim is fraudulent, which means we need to find evidence that connects him to Vanessa's infiltration of Daniel's life. Then what? Then we go to war. Elena reached for her phone. I know someone who can help with that, she said. Someone who just got suspended from the bar because she was too good at her job. Joyce Palmer answered on the second ring. Tell me you have good news, Joyce said. I am sitting in my apartment surrounded by my own case files, and I am going crazy not being able to help you. How would you feel about helping from behind the scenes? Elena asked. Because I just found out who has been funding my company for 3 years, and he has a plan that might actually work. Through the phone, Elena could hear Joyce sit up straighter. I am listening, Joyce said. Elena looked at Thomas, who was already pulling documents from his messenger bag. We are going to need a lot of coffee, Elena said, and probably some wine, and a very good printer. The war for Grace's future had just begun. Rosa Martinez had kept the envelope hidden for 15 years in the one place she knew Margaret Thornton would never look. The servants' quarters. Specifically, she had sewn it into the lining of an old coat that hung in the back of her closet, a coat so worn and faded that it had become invisible through familiarity. Margaret had ordered Rosa's room searched twice over the years, looking for evidence that never materialized, never realizing that the proof of her crimes was hanging in plain sight. When Rosa finally gave the envelope to Elena, her hands were trembling. I kept it because he asked me to, Rosa said, her accent thickening with emotion she had suppressed for over a decade. Robert was a good man. He was kind to me when kindness was not required. He treated me like a person when his wife treated everyone like furniture. She sat down heavily on the edge of Elena's hospital bed. When he told me he was going to divorce her, I was afraid for him. I had seen what Margaret did to people who defied her, the way she destroyed them slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. What happened? Elena asked gently. Rosa's eyes filled with tears she had not allowed herself to cry in 15 years. He died 3 days later. Heart failure, they said. But Robert was healthy. He played tennis every week. He had just had a physical examination that showed nothing wrong. She looked at the envelope in Elena's hands. The night before he died, he gave me this. He said if anything happened to him, I should keep it safe until someone was strong enough to use it. He said the truth was inside, and the truth would protect whoever was brave enough to tell it. Elena opened the envelope carefully. Inside were documents, financial records, handwritten letters, a detailed account of how Margaret Thornton and her brother had manipulated Robert's business dealings to create the appearance of insurance fraud, then used that manufactured scandal to force Robert into a position where his only options were to stay in a marriage that was destroying him or face criminal charges for crimes he had not committed. There was also a small notebook, Robert's personal journal from the last month of his life. His handwriting was neat and precise, the writing of someone who knew he was documenting something important. Elena read the final entry out loud. I confronted Margaret today. I told her I know what she and William did with the insurance documents. I told her I am going to expose everything and file for divorce. She looked at me with an expression I have never seen before, cold, calculating, like she was measuring me for a coffin. She said I would regret this decision. She said no one leaves the Thornton family. No one. Rosa was crying openly now. He was dead 2 days later, and I was too afraid to say anything, too afraid of what she would do to me, to my family, to my children who were still in school and depending on my income. She gripped Elena's hand. I have carried this guilt for 15 years, knowing the truth and being too weak to tell it, watching Margaret hurt person after person and staying silent because silence was safer than courage. Elena looked at this woman who had survived decades of invisible service, who had witnessed cruelty she could not stop, who had kept a dead man's truth alive against impossible odds. You are not weak, Elena said. You survived. You protected this evidence. You waited until there was someone who could use it. That is not weakness. That is strategic patience. She gestured to Thomas, who was already photographing every document. And now we are going to make sure Robert's truth finally gets told. The evidence Robert Thornton had gathered painted a picture of systematic fraud and manipulation spanning decades. Margaret and her brother William had created fake insurance claims through companies they secretly controlled. They had manufactured documentation of losses that never occurred. They had collected millions of dollars from policies designed to defraud both insurers and investors. And when Robert discovered the scheme and threatened to expose it, they had framed him as the perpetrator, created paper trails that made him look guilty of their crimes, trapped him in a position where his only choices were complicity or destruction. The heart failure that killed him 3 days after he confronted Margaret had never been independently investigated. The coroner was William's cousin. The medical records had convenient gaps. The life insurance policy, which Margaret had increased 6 months before Robert's death, paid out without question. This is enough to reopen the investigation, Thomas said. his voice tight with controlled rage. "This is enough to bring criminal charges against Margaret and William both, but it is not enough to stop the custody hearing," Joyce said through the laptop screen, where she was participating remotely. "The hearing is in 5 days. Even if we get this to the right people, the legal process will take months. Which is why we need to focus on Marcus Webb," Elena said. "He is the immediate threat. His intellectual property claim is what is blocking my money. His daughter is what is blocking Daniel from seeing the truth." She pulled up the documents Thomas had compiled about Marcus Webb's business dealings. "If we can prove that Vanessa was planted to manipulate Daniel, we can prove that Marcus has been committing fraud against Sterling Financial. That makes his claim against my company part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior. And once Marcus falls," Joyce added, "his lawyers will have bigger problems than harassing you. They will be trying to save their own careers." "There is one more thing," Thomas said. He hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "I did not want to show you this until we had more evidence. But now, I think you need to see it." He played a recording. The audio quality was poor, but the voices were unmistakable. Marcus Webb's voice: "The Mitchell woman is getting too close. Her company has data on 3 of my ex-wives. If that information gets connected to my involvement with Vanessa, we are finished." Vanessa's voice: "What do you want me to do about it?" Marcus: "The custody hearing is our best chance. If we can get guardianship of the baby, we can force her to sign over the company in exchange for access to her child. She will do anything for that kid." Vanessa: "And if she does not?" Marcus: "Then we make sure she never gets the chance. I have people who can ensure she fails a drug test. I have doctors who will sign whatever evaluation I need. I have judges who owe me favors going back 20 years. The recording ended. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "They are not just trying to take my daughter," she said slowly. "They are planning to use her as leverage to steal my company." Thomas nodded. Marcus has been watching Dignity grow for the past 2 years. He knows its potential. He knows that an app which helps abuse victims document evidence could be worth billions in the right market. So he planted Vanessa with Daniel to get access to Sterling Financial, Joyce said, pieces falling into place. And when Elena's company became more valuable than whatever he was going to steal from Sterling, he pivoted to a new target. "My baby," Elena whispered. "He saw my baby as an asset." The room was silent. Then Elena stood up. "I want everyone who did this to face consequences," she said, her voice steady. Margaret for what she did to Robert. Marcus for what he planned to do to Grace. Vanessa for her part in all of it. Everyone. She looked at Thomas, then at Joyce's image on the screen. "But first we need to win the custody hearing. Because none of this matters if I lose my daughter." "We have 5 days," Thomas said. "Then we better get to work," Elena replied. The morning of the custody hearing, Elena Mitchell walked into the family courthouse wearing a dress she had bought at a thrift store for $11 and carrying documentation that would destroy a family worth billions. She had no lawyer beside her. Joyce's suspension had not been lifted, and every other attorney they approached had been warned away by Marcus Webb's network. Elena would be representing herself against a team of 3 lawyers who had been preparing for this moment for months. The courtroom was packed. Margaret Thornton sat in the front row, wearing an expression of confident triumph. Daniel sat beside her, his face unreadable. Vanessa was notably absent, though Elena knew exactly where she was, at the FBI field office downtown, where Thomas's evidence had triggered an emergency investigation that was still unfolding. Judge William Crawford presided. He was Margaret's golf partner, her brother's friend, a man whose entire career had been built on the patronage of families like the Thorntons. Elena had expected bias. She had prepared for it. What she had not expected was the woman who walked into the courtroom Just as proceedings were about to begin, Rosa Martinez was wearing her best church dress. Her hands were shaking, but her head was held high. "Your Honor," Rosa said, her voice carrying across the silent room, "I would like to be heard as a witness in this matter." Judge Crawford looked annoyed. "This is a custody hearing, not an open forum. You cannot simply walk in and demand to testify." Rosa reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "My name is Rosa Martinez. I have worked for the Thornton family for 20 years. I have witnessed things that this court needs to hear, and I have evidence that the petitioner in this case, Margaret Thornton, is not fit to have guardianship of any child." Margaret stood up. "This is outrageous. She is a disgruntled employee. She was terminated last week for theft." "That is a lie," Rosa said calmly. "I was terminated because Mrs. Thornton discovered I was planning to testify today. She offered me $50,000 to leave the country. When I refused, she had me escorted off the property by security and told everyone I had stolen silverware." She looked directly at Margaret. "I kept a recording of that conversation. Would you like me to play it?" The courtroom exploded. Over the next 2 hours, Rosa testified about everything she had witnessed in 20 years of service. The abuse of Elena, the manipulation of Daniel, the suspicious circumstances of Robert Thornton's death. The envelope she had kept hidden for 15 years. She produced photographs, documents, recordings she had made on her phone when she realized what was coming. Evidence that showed a pattern of cruelty and control spanning decades. When the Thornton lawyers tried to discredit her, Rosa remained calm. "I am not a lawyer," she said. "I am not educated like you. I am just a woman who cleaned houses and kept quiet when I should have spoken. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that woman," she pointed at Margaret, "should never be allowed near a child." The judge called a recess. During the break, Thomas approached Elena in the hallway. "Marcus Webb was just arrested," he said quietly. "FBI took him from his office in handcuffs. It is all over the news." "What about Vanessa?" "Being questioned as a cooperating witness. Apparently she decided that throwing her father under the bus was preferable to going to prison herself." Elena felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in months. Hope. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The Thornton lawyers looked shaken. Margaret's confident expression had cracked. Even Judge Crawford seemed uncertain about how to proceed. Elena stood to address the court. "Your Honor, I am not here to destroy anyone. I am here to protect my daughter. I am here because every child deserves a parent who will fight for them, not a system that protects people who hurt them." She placed a folder on the table. "This documentation shows that Margaret Thornton committed fraud against her own husband, that she has a pattern of abuse against vulnerable people, that her petition for guardianship is part of a larger scheme orchestrated by Marcus Webb to seize control of my company." She looked at Daniel, who was staring at the table in front of him. "It also shows that my husband has been manipulated by people who used him as a tool. That does not excuse what he did to me, but it does mean that somewhere inside him there might be someone capable of being better." Elena turned back to the judge. "I am asking for full custody of my daughter Grace. I am asking for a protective order against Margaret Thornton. And I am asking this court to remember that its job is to protect children, not to protect the wealthy." The gallery was silent. Judge Crawford looked at the evidence in front of him, looked at Margaret, whose mask had finally slipped to reveal something ugly beneath, looked at Daniel, who had not said a word in his mother's defense. "This court will need time to review the documentation," the judge said slowly. "But based on the testimony presented today, I am denying the emergency guardianship petition." Margaret made a sound like she had been struck. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am ordering a full investigation into the allegations raised against Mrs. Margaret Thornton. Until that investigation is complete, She is to have no contact with the minor child. He looked at Elena. Mrs. Mitchell, this court grants you temporary full custody of your daughter, Grace. A permanent custody arrangement will be determined following the conclusion of the investigation. Elena's knees buckled. She grabbed the table to keep from falling. Behind her, she heard Rosa crying, heard Joyce shouting through the phone in Thomas's hand, heard the sound of flashbulbs from reporters who had gathered outside the courtroom. But all she could think about was her daughter. Her daughter, who was safe. Her daughter, who she would get to raise. Her daughter, who would never know the fear of being used as a bargaining chip by people who saw children as assets instead of human beings. Daniel caught her eye across the courtroom. His face was devastated, lost, the expression of a man who had just watched everything he believed dissolve into evidence of his own blindness. Elena did not feel satisfaction at his pain. She did not feel triumph or revenge or any of the emotions she had imagined feeling at this moment. She just felt tired and ready to go home. 6 months after the custody hearing, Elena Mitchell stood in the lobby of a building that had not existed a year ago. The Dignity Project headquarters occupied 3 floors of a renovated warehouse in downtown. The walls were covered with letters from users who credited the app with saving their lives. The conference rooms were named after women who had survived abuse and gone on to help others. The break room always had fresh coffee and the understanding that everyone who worked there had a story that brought them to this place. Elena had not planned to build a company. She had planned to survive. But survival, it turned out, sometimes created something bigger than itself. The acquisition had closed 2 weeks after Marcus Webb's arrest. With no one left to block the transaction, Elena's $340 million had finally landed in her account. She had used it to hire the best lawyers money could buy, to establish a foundation for abuse survivors, to create jobs for women who needed second chances, and to buy her freedom from the Thornton family permanently. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in June. Daniel had not contested anything. He had signed over his share of the estate, waived his claims to Elena's business, agreed to every term Joyce's team had proposed. When Elena asked him why, he had looked at her with eyes that had finally learned to see. Because I spent 4 years watching you get hurt and telling myself it was not my responsibility to stop it, Daniel said. Because I let my mother convince me that cruelty was normal and kindness was weakness. Because I looked at you and saw someone to control instead of someone to love. He had paused, struggling with words that did not come easily to someone who had never been required to examine himself. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot give you back the years I wasted, but I can stop fighting you. I can stop being another obstacle you have to overcome. And I can try, for the first time in my life, to be the kind of man my daughter would not be ashamed to know. Elena had not forgiven him. She was not sure she ever would. But she had given him something more important than forgiveness: the opportunity to prove he could change. Daniel's supervised visitation had begun a month ago. He was required to complete therapy, to maintain no contact with Margaret, to demonstrate consistent, reliable, safe behavior for a minimum of 1 year before any expansion of his parental rights. Most people would have fought those restrictions. Daniel had accepted them without argument. I do not deserve to see her at all, he had told the court. These requirements are not a punishment. They are a chance, and I intend to earn it. Margaret Thornton had not been so accommodating. The investigation triggered by Rosa's testimony had uncovered decades of fraud, insurance schemes, tax evasion, suspicious financial transactions that suggested Margaret's wealth was built on crimes that stretched back to before Robert Thornton's death. She had been arrested in her home on a Wednesday afternoon, still wearing the designer dress she had chosen for a charity luncheon she would never attend. The photographs of her being led to a police car had appeared on the front page of every newspaper in the country. Her trial was scheduled to begin in 3 months. Prosecutors were seeking 25 years. But the most devastating consequence for Margaret was not the legal proceedings. It was the social exile. Every friend she had cultivated over 40 years had abandoned her. The country club had revoked her membership. The charity boards had removed her name from their donor walls. The society pages that had once celebrated her parties now detailed her crimes. Margaret Thornton had spent her entire life believing that money and status made her untouchable. She was learning that cruelty caught up with everyone eventually. Vanessa Price had disappeared. Her cooperation with the FBI had kept her out of prison, but it had not saved her career. Her Instagram had been deleted. Her brand partnerships had evaporated. The influencer empire she had built on the foundation of other people's pain had crumbled into nothing. Rumors placed her somewhere in Europe, living off whatever money she had managed to hide before her father's assets were frozen. Elena did not care enough to confirm. Marcus Webb was awaiting trial on 17 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. His lawyers were negotiating a plea deal that would likely result in 12 to 15 years in federal prison. The evidence Elena's app had collected anonymized data showing patterns of abuse by powerful men against vulnerable women had sparked a class action lawsuit that would eventually cost Marcus Webb everything he had ever built. His daughter had helped destroy him. The women he had hurt had finally been heard. Rosa Martinez was now the director of community outreach at Dignity. Her first act in the role had been to create a program that helped domestic workers document and report abuse by their employers. Her second act had been to establish a scholarship fund for children of survivors. She still cried sometimes when she talked about Robert Thornton, but she also smiled now, which she had not done in 15 years. I kept his truth alive, Rosa said to Elena one afternoon. And now that truth is helping thousands of women find their own voices. Joyce Palmer had been reinstated to the bar 3 months after the hearing. The ethics investigation had revealed that the complaints against her had been fabricated by lawyers connected to Marcus Webb. She had received an official apology from the Bar Association and an unofficial offer of partnership from 3 major firms. She had turned them all down. I am building something here, Joyce told Elena, something that matters. I spent 20 years working in a system that protects the powerful. Now I get to work in a system that protects everyone else. She had become the head of legal partnerships at Dignity, connecting users with pro bono attorneys across the country. Her voice still filled Elena's phone with increasingly dramatic messages. Girl, Joyce had said just that morning, we just hit 50,000 successful legal consultations through the app. 50,000 women who got help because you refused to give up. How am I supposed to act normal after statistics like that? Thomas Thornton had moved to the city permanently. He lived in a modest apartment 3 blocks from the Dignity offices, where he worked as Chief Technology Officer. He and Daniel had not spoken since the custody hearing. The relationship between the brothers, never strong to begin with, had shattered under the weight of Thomas's testimony against their mother. But Thomas did not seem to regret his choices. I spent 8 years running from my family, Thomas told Elena, pretending that distance was the same as standing up. You taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop running and fight. Grace was 9 months old now. She was healthy and happy and completely unaware of the war that had been fought for her future. Elena held her daughter every morning and every night, marveling at the small miracle of fingers and toes and eyes that looked at the world with uncomplicated wonder. She had been afraid during the darkest moments, that she would never get this, that her daughter would be taken and raised by people who saw children as possessions instead of people. Now she understood something that the Thorntons had never grasped. Real power was not about controlling others. It was about protecting the people who could not protect themselves. And Elena Mitchell had more power than she had ever imagined. The garden party at the Dignity Project Community Center was smaller than any event the Thorntons had ever hosted. No marble floors, no champagne fountains, no 150 guests performing wealth for each other's benefit. Just 43 women and their children, gathered on a sunny afternoon to celebrate the first anniversary of a program that had changed their lives. Elena stood at the edge of the gathering, watching Grace toddle across the grass toward a group of children who were chasing bubbles that Rosa was blowing from a plastic wand. Her daughter was walking now, had spoken her first word 2 months ago, a sound that might have been mama or might have been more, depending on how optimistic Elena was feeling that day. Grace had Daniel's eyes, but she had Elena's determination, visible in the way she picked herself up every time she fell, in the way she reached for things just beyond her grasp, in the way she seemed to understand that the world would not always be gentle and she would need to be strong. You know, Joyce said, appearing beside Elena with a glass of something that was definitely not champagne. I used to think success meant winning cases, making partner, having my name on a door. She gestured at the children playing, at the mothers watching them with expressions of peace that many of them had never expected to feel. This is better, Joyce said. This is so much better. Elena nodded. Dignity had grown beyond anything she had originally imagined. 200,000 active users across the country. Partnerships with law enforcement agencies, domestic violence shelters, family courts. An advisory board that included survivors, attorneys, advocates, and technologists who believed that systemic change was possible if enough people committed to making it happen. But the numbers were not what mattered to Elena. What mattered was the woman across the garden who was laughing for the first time since escaping a marriage that had nearly killed her. What mattered was the child who would grow up knowing that her mother had fought for their freedom. What mattered was the ripple effect of one woman's choice to document her pain instead of drowning in it. A car pulled up at the edge of the property. Elena tensed, old reflexes still sometimes triggering at unexpected arrivals. But the man who emerged was not a threat. He was Daniel Thornton, arriving for his scheduled visitation, carrying a stuffed elephant he had bought at a toy store that morning. He looked different now. The polished predator who had watched his wife be humiliated was gone, replaced by something softer, something uncertain, something still learning how to be human. His therapy was ongoing. His relationship with Elena was functional rather than friendly. But he showed up, every time, without fail. And he was trying, in his limited way, to be something other than what his family had taught him to be. Grace spotted her father and squealed, Tuttle running toward him with the unconditional joy of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid. Daniel knelt to catch her, his face transforming into something Elena had never seen during their marriage. Genuine, uncomplicated love. He looked up and met Elena's eyes, across the garden, nodded once, then turned his attention entirely to his daughter. Elena watched them together, watched Daniel point at the elephant, making Grace laugh, watched him sit in the grass in clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, unconcerned about dirt or appearance or what anyone might think. She did not feel love for him. She was not sure she ever really had. What she had felt was the desperate hope that someone would choose her, and she had mistaken that hope for something deeper. But she felt something she had not expected to feel. Gratitude, not for the years of cruelty, not for the humiliation or the gaslighting or the systematic destruction of her confidence. She was grateful for the lesson. She had learned that she was stronger than she knew, that she could survive things she thought would kill her, that she could build something meaningful from the wreckage of something terrible. And she had learned that the most important relationship she would ever have was not with a husband or a family or a company. It was with herself. Elena, Thomas called from across the garden, where he was helping Rosa set up tables for lunch. Come look at this. She walked over to find Thomas holding a framed article. The headline read, Dignity app reaches 1 million users as founder launches national initiative. The reporter had written about Elena's journey, the banquet hall, the custody battle, the building of a company that was changing how America responded to domestic abuse. But the quote they had highlighted was not about business metrics or legal victories. It was something Elena had said during the interview, almost as an afterthought. They asked me what I learned from 4 years of being told I was worthless. I learned that power is not about crushing people who hurt you. It is about building something that helps the people who come after you. Rosa was crying again, but these were different tears than the ones she had shed for Robert Thornton. These were tears of joy. He would be so proud, Rosa said. Robert always believed that good people could change things. He just did not live long enough to see it happen. Elena hugged the woman who had become something between a mother and a partner, a friend and a teacher. He sees it, Elena said. Somehow. I think he sees it. The party continued through the afternoon. Children played, mothers laughed. Survivors shared stories of how far they had come and helped newcomers imagine how far they could go. As the sun began to set, Elena found herself alone at the edge of the garden, Grace sleeping in her arms. She thought about the woman who had scrubbed floors at her own anniversary party, who had smiled at her abusers while calculating their destruction, who had built an empire in silence while everyone dismissed her as worthless. That woman had been angry, determined, burning with a righteous fury that had sustained her through years of documented cruelty. Elena was different now. Not softer exactly, but more at peace. She had learned that revenge was not a destination, that destroying your enemies did not heal the wounds they had inflicted, that the only real victory was building a life worth living, surrounded by people worth loving, doing work worth doing. Margaret Thornton was in prison. Marcus Webb was awaiting sentencing. Vanessa Price was forgotten. But Elena was not thinking about them. She was thinking about her daughter, who would grow up knowing that her mother had fought for her, that her mother had built something from nothing, that her mother had refused to be small when the world tried to crush her. Grace would never scrub anyone's floor unless she chose to. Not because Elena was wealthy now, but because Grace would know that her worth was not for anyone else to decide. That was the inheritance Elena was building. Not money or status or the particular kind of cruelty that wealthy families pass down like heirlooms. She was building a legacy of dignity. And every day, with every woman her app helped, with every child protected by the systems she had created, with every survivor who found the courage to tell their story because someone else had told theirs first, that legacy grew stronger. Joyce appeared at her side, watching the sunset. You know what I think? Joyce said. Elena smiled. You are going to tell me anyway. I think that floor they made you scrub was the best thing that ever happened to you. Because it showed you exactly who they were. And it showed them exactly who you were not. She clinked her glass against an imaginary glass in Elena's hand. To building it stronger, Joyce said. Elena looked at her sleeping daughter, at the community center full of survivors, at the world she was slowly, steadily changing. To building it stronger, she agreed, and somewhere in the golden light of a setting sun, Robert Thornton's truth was finally at peace. If this opening already has you wanting to know what happens next, you are exactly the kind of viewer who will love the full story. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Elena's position. Would you have stayed silent? Would you have fought back sooner? I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to know your thoughts. If stories like this resonate with you, if you believe that content should inspire and educate and not just entertain, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss when we release the next chapter. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, someone who might be going through something similar, share this video with them. Sometimes a story is exactly what someone needs to find their own courage. Now let us begin. Closing disclaimer. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every detail has been crafted to ensure you receive not just entertainment, but wisdom you can carry with you long after the story ends. Thank you for being part of our community.